Marcus Chen didn't fit the stereotype of a tech logistics CEO. While his competitors chased headlines with rocket launches and robot demos, he spent his evenings reading employee feedback forums and studying warehouse efficiency reports. That's how he built SwiftShip from a small delivery startup into a billion-dollar logistics empire, by obsessing over the small details others overlooked. But tonight, something on his screen troubled him deeply. It started with an anonymous post on the company's internal feedback platform. Maybe if management spent a night in the parking lot, they'd understand why so many of us sleep in our cars. The comment had hundreds of reactions from warehouse workers, with similar stories flooding the replies. Some mentioned choosing between rent and food. Others described living in their vehicles between brutal 12-hour shifts. Marcus felt his chest tighten as he scrolled through story after story. The logistics titan leaned back in his ergonomic office chair, staring out the floor-to-ceiling windows of his Seattle headquarters. Below, the city sparkled with evening lights, but his mind was fixed on the massive SwiftShip warehouses scattered across the country. He'd always prided himself on creating good jobs, on offering competitive wages and benefits. The company's mission statement, painted in bold letters in every facility, read, "Moving humanity forward." But these stories painted a very different picture. Marcus pulled up the wage reports and cost of living data for their major warehouse locations. The numbers seemed reasonable on paper: above minimum wage, standard benefits package, regular performance bonuses. Yet something wasn't adding up. He thought about his last warehouse tour 6 months ago. Everything had looked efficient, productive, perfectly in order. But now he wondered what he hadn't seen, what realities might be hiding behind the polished quarterly reports and carefully managed visits. He opened his laptop again, clicking through to the employee forums. More stories emerged. Workers carpooling from hours away to afford rent, people choosing between medical bills and housing payments, young parents working double shifts while living out of their vehicles. The details varied, but a common thread emerged. The competitive wages weren't keeping up with skyrocketing housing costs near the warehouse locations. His phone buzzed with a message from Jennifer, his chief of operations. Seeing increased chatter about housing issues on worker forums. PR team suggests standard response about competitive compensation package. Thoughts? Marcus stared at the message, feeling a familiar determination rise within him. He'd built SwiftShip by understanding ground-level realities, not by issuing corporate statements. If workers were sleeping in their cars, he needed to see it for himself. But how could a CEO known for his casual hoodies and jeans disguise himself enough to understand the true scope of this crisis? He pulled up the profile of their newest warehouse, a massive facility in Oakland that had opened just 3 months ago. The location had been chosen for its proximity to shipping routes, but he now noticed it sat in one of the Bay Area's most expensive regions. According to the forum posts, this warehouse had the highest concentration of employees reporting housing issues. Marcus opened his bottom desk drawer, pushing aside old papers until his fingers found what he was looking for: a worn baseball cap from his startup days, back when he used to help load trucks himself. He held it up, studying its faded logo. As an idea took shape, SwiftShip's warehouse workers didn't know his face. He'd always been more comfortable letting his executives handle public appearances while he focused on operations. With the right preparation, he could work alongside them, experience their reality firsthand. His mind raced with the implications. If workers were truly living in their cars, if the compensation wasn't sufficient for basic housing, it meant SwiftShip's entire approach to worker welfare needed reassessment. But he needed more than anonymous forum posts. He needed to see it with his own eyes, to understand the daily reality of the people who kept his company running. Marcus pulled up the warehouse hiring portal, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. With his experience, creating a believable background wouldn't be difficult. The hard part would be living it, working the same shifts, facing the same challenges, without the safety net of his regular life. He thought about his comfortable home, his reliable car, his stocked fridge. How many of his workers had to choose between those basic necessities? Determination set in as he began filling out the application. He would spend 2 weeks as a warehouse worker, living exactly as they lived, working exactly as they worked. No special treatment, no safety net, no escape hatch. Only then could he truly understand what needed to change. His phone buzzed again. Another message from Jennifer about the PR response. Marcus ignored it, focused instead on crafting his new identity. In 2 days, Mark Chang would start his first shift at the Oakland warehouse, just another worker trying to make ends meet, in one of America's most expensive cities. What he would discover there would shake the foundation of everything he thought he knew about his company. Marcus hadn't always moved in corporate circles. 15 years ago, SwiftShip began in his parents' garage, where he personally loaded packages into his beat-up Toyota Corolla. Back then, he knew every driver's name, their family stories, their struggles. He'd help cover shifts when someone's child was sick, or loan money when a worker's car broke down. The company culture wasn't something written in a handbook. It lived in those daily interactions, in the genuine care they showed for each other. He remembered Maria, his first hire, a single mother who balanced deliveries with caring for her teenage son. When her landlord doubled the rent, forcing her to consider quitting to move to a cheaper city, Marcus had worked out a solution. He adjusted her route to include areas closer to affordable housing, then helped her find an apartment within her budget. Maria still worked for SwiftShip, now managing their driver training program. She often told new hires how that moment of compassion had changed her life. Those early experiences shaped Marcus's business philosophy. While other startups chased rapid growth at any cost, he focused on building sustainable relationships with his workforce. He implemented profit-sharing programs when the company was still small, ensuring everyone benefited from their collective success. The media called him naive, but employee retention soared and productivity followed. Word spread about the delivery company that treated people like family, not numbers. As SwiftShip expanded, Marcus insisted on maintaining that human touch. He created an open-door policy for worker feedback, established emergency assistance funds for employees in crisis, and required executives to spend time in the field every quarter. The company's growth exploded, but somewhere along the way, something had changed. The anonymous forum post suggested the culture he'd worked so hard to build had eroded, replaced by the very corporate coldness he'd once fought against. Standing in his home office, Marcus pulled out an old photo album. The pictures told the story of SwiftShip's evolution, from a handful of people sorting packages on folding tables to the technological marvel it had become. He paused at a group photo from 10 years ago, taken outside their first real warehouse. The smiles looked genuine then, the sense of shared purpose palpable. When had that spirit begun to fade? His phone chimed with another message from corporate PR, suggesting a company-wide email addressing the housing concerns with carefully crafted language about market competitive compensation. Marcus felt a familiar frustration rise. This was exactly the kind of corporate response he'd always despised, addressing symptoms while ignoring the underlying disease. He pulled up SwiftShip's latest annual report. The numbers were impressive: record profits, expanding market share, glowing coverage from Wall Street analysts. But these metrics told only part of the story. What good were soaring stock prices if the people who made it all possible couldn't afford a roof over their heads? Marcus walked to his closet, pushing past tailored suits to find the clothes he'd worn in those early garage days. The faded jeans and worn work boots remained as reminders of where he'd started. He'd kept them not out of sentimentality, but as anchors to his core values. Now, they would serve a different purpose, helping him understand how far his company had strayed from its founding principles. His laptop pinged with an automated response from the warehouse hiring system. His application as Mark Chang had been accepted. Orientation would begin Monday morning at 5 a.m. The irony wasn't lost on him. His own company's hiring algorithm had no idea it had just approved its CEO for an entry-level position. Looking at his reflection in the bedroom mirror, Marcus realized how much his appearance had changed over the years. The designer glasses, the expertly styled hair, the subtle signals of success he'd accumulated, they all had to go. He needed to become invisible, just another face in the crowd of workers struggling to make ends meet in the shadow of Silicon Valley's wealth. He thought about Maria again, and countless others who'd believed in SwiftShip's mission in those early days. They'd trusted him to build something different, something better than the soulless corporations that treated workers as disposable resources. Now, 15 years later, he had to face the possibility that he'd failed them. His smartwatch buzzed with calendar reminders, board meetings, investor calls, strategic planning sessions. He'd have to craft a careful excuse for his 2-week absence. The board wouldn't understand his methods, might even try to stop him if they knew. But Marcus had built SwiftShip by trusting his instincts, by getting his hands dirty when others would have delegated. This situation demanded nothing less. Tomorrow he would begin his transformation. But tonight he had research to do. Marcus pulled up housing costs near the Oakland warehouse, local rental listings, and employee salary data. He needed to understand the full scope of the crisis before stepping into his workers' shoes. The numbers painted a stark picture. Even SwiftShip's competitive wages fell far short of local living costs. No wonder people were sleeping in their cars. The real question was, how had he let this happen on his watch? The Oakland warehouse loomed before Marcus as he drove past. It in his rental car, a 10-year-old Honda Civic chosen specifically for its anonymity. The massive structure stretched across several city blocks, its blue and white SwiftShip logo visible from the freeway. The surrounding parking lot was already filling up with cars as the night shift headed home and morning workers arrived. What caught his attention, though, were the vehicles scattered around the lot's outer edges, some with fogged windows, others with makeshift curtains. His heart sank as he realized these weren't just parked cars, they were people's homes. He pulled into a nearby coffee shop, ordering the cheapest drink on the menu while discreetly observing the warehouse's morning rhythm. Workers trudged between their cars and the building's entrance, many carrying backpacks that looked too full for just a lunch break. Some stopped at their vehicles, changing clothes or grabbing toiletries before heading to what he assumed were the warehouse's shower facilities, an amenity he'd once proudly approved as a convenience for workers who hit the gym before or after shifts. A group of employees entered the coffee shop, their conversations drifting over to where Marcus sat with his cooling coffee. "Water bills due next week," one woman sighed, dark circles visible under her eyes. "Guess I'm staying in the lot another month." Her companions nodded sympathetically, one offering to share his gym membership so she could use the showers there instead of the crowded warehouse facilities. Marcus pulled out his phone, opening a note-taking app. He'd already discovered that the average one-bedroom apartment within a 30-mile radius of the warehouse cost more than 60% of a worker's monthly take-home pay. Add in utilities, food, healthcare costs, and transportation, and the math became impossible. The forum posts hadn't exaggerated. His workers weren't choosing to live in their cars, they were being forced to by simple economics. His research had revealed another troubling pattern. When SwiftShip first selected this location, the surrounding area had been relatively affordable. but the warehouse's presence had attracted other businesses, driving up property values and rents. The very success of his company was partly responsible for pricing out its workers. The irony felt like a physical weight on his shoulders. A new group of workers entered the coffee shop. Their conversation focused on sharing tips about safe parking spots. "Behind the old shopping center is good," one man explained. "Security doesn't bother you if you're gone by 7. Another mentioned a church that allowed overnight parking as long as you attended Sunday service. They spoke with the weary expertise of people who'd learned these lessons the hard way. Marcus watched as they pooled their money to share a single muffin, each taking careful bites while making it last through their entire conversation. These weren't the lazy, unmotivated workers that some board members had dismissed in meetings. These were people working full-time jobs at one of the world's most successful logistics companies, yet they couldn't afford one of life's most basic necessities: a home. His phone buzzed with an email from Jennifer, his COO. The PR team had drafted a statement addressing the housing situation, emphasizing SwiftShip's competitive wages and comprehensive benefits package. They recommended highlighting individual success stories to counter the negative narrative emerging on social media. Marcus felt a surge of anger as he read the suggested talking points. They were missing the point entirely. Looking back at the warehouse, he noticed something that hadn't been visible from the main road, a small tent community forming in the wooded area behind the parking lot. The company had purchased that land for future expansion, but for now, it provided hidden shelter for workers who couldn't even afford to live in their cars. The sight made his coffee taste bitter in his mouth. He opened SwiftShip's employee handbook on his phone, scrolling to the section about company values. Dignity through opportunity stood out mockingly. What dignity was there in working 12-hour shifts only to sleep in your car? What opportunity existed when every pay raise was swallowed by rising rents? The words he'd once written with such conviction now felt hollow. A security guard began making rounds through the parking lot, shining his flashlight into car windows. Despite the morning light, Marcus watched as people quickly sat up in their vehicles, pretending they hadn't been sleeping. The guard seemed to hesitate at each car, as if struggling between enforcing policy and showing humanity. This wasn't what Marcus had meant when he'd implemented 24-hour security to protect our SwiftShip family. Tomorrow, he would begin his first shift as Mark Chang, just another new hire trying to make it in the Bay Area. But today, he needed to understand the full scope of what his workers faced. He started his rental car and began following the routes his employees had mentioned, mapping out the places they sought refuge when they couldn't afford a home. Each stop revealed a new facet of the crisis: crowded parking lots, hidden tent clusters, and everywhere, people trying to maintain their dignity while living on the margins of one of the world's wealthiest regions. The problem wasn't just about wages or housing costs in isolation. It was about the growing disconnect between SwiftShip's success and the reality faced by the people who made that success possible. As Marcus documented each location, each conversation overheard, each sign of his workers' hidden struggles, he realized this investigation would reveal far more than he was prepared to face. The question was, once he understood the true scope of the crisis, would he have the courage to make the dramatic changes needed to fix it? Back in his hotel room, deliberately chosen for its distance from the tech corridor where he usually stayed, Marcus spread his research across the bed. Employee schedules, housing costs, local zoning laws, and dozens of photographs he'd taken of the makeshift car living arrangements filled the generic floral comforter. The more he examined the evidence, the clearer it became that a simple wage increase wouldn't solve the underlying problems. He opened his laptop to review Mark Chang's employee profile one final time. The background he'd created was carefully crafted. Recent Bay Area transplant, previous warehouse experience in Nevada, living out of his car while trying to establish himself in California. It wasn't just a cover story, it was the reality many of his workers lived. His orientation paperwork indicated he'd be assigned to the shipping department, working the demanding 4 a.m. to 4 p.m. shift that offered a slight pay premium for the inconvenient hours. Marcus pulled out the second-hand clothes he'd purchased from various thrift stores. Each item had been selected to build his new identity: worn steel-toe boots, faded jeans with authentic wear marks, T-shirts that had seen better days. He'd even bought an old sleeping bag and basic camping supplies, not just as props, but because he intended to use them. If he was going to understand his workers' reality, he had to live it completely. His phone rang. Jennifer again. He let it go to voicemail, knowing she was probably calling about the PR statement. Instead, he focused on removing the subtle markers of wealth from his appearance. The expensive watch was replaced with a basic digital timepiece. His designer glasses, swapped for an older pair he'd kept as backup. He'd already let his usually neat hair grow out, and a few days without his regular grooming routine had left him with stubble that helped obscure his features. A notification popped up on his laptop. Another wave of comments on the employee. A forum. Someone had posted photos of the tent community behind the warehouse, sparking heated discussions about living conditions. The comments ranged from shared experiences to calls for unionization. One post particularly caught his attention. They build these massive warehouses, but can't build affordable housing for the people who run them. The idea struck him like lightning. SwiftShip owned hundreds of acres of undeveloped land around its facilities, land held for future expansion. What if some of that space could be repurposed? He quickly pulled up zoning maps, property records, and local housing regulations. The complexity of the problem began to take shape. It wasn't just about building housing. It was about challenging the entire system that had created this crisis. Marcus opened a new document, typing rapidly as ideas formed. Beyond the immediate investigation, he needed a longer-term strategy. Worker housing was just the beginning. The whole compensation structure needed rethinking, not just wages, but housing assistance, transportation subsidies, maybe even profit-sharing programs like they'd had in the early days. But first, he needed to understand exactly how the current system was failing. He created a checklist for his undercover mission. Document all additional costs workers faced beyond housing. Track the real hours worked versus scheduled shifts. Identify informal support networks among employees. Map the distances people commuted to avoid higher rents. Observe management's day-to-day treatment of workers. Experience firsthand the physical demands of the job. His smartwatch buzzed. With another calendar reminder about tomorrow's board meeting, he'd arranged for his absence, citing a personal emergency that would take him off-grid for 2 weeks. The board hadn't questioned it. They rarely questioned anything he did, which might be part of the problem. Had he become too removed from the real operations of his company? Marcus packed his new identity into the worn backpack he'd purchased. A change of clothes, basic toiletries, a cheap phone loaded with a prepaid plan. The rest would stay in his rental car, which would become his home for the next 2 weeks. He'd chosen the Honda Civic, not just for its anonymity, but for its spacious back seat, a feature he'd noticed many car-dwelling workers prioritized. A knock at his hotel door startled him. Opening it, he found a young housekeeper apologizing for the late service. The interaction gave him pause. Here was another worker likely facing similar housing struggles. The crisis he'd discovered at his warehouse wasn't isolated. It was a symptom of a broader societal failure. But SwiftShip had the resources to be part of the solution if he could figure out the right approach. Returning to his preparations, Marcus recorded a video message to be delivered to the board if anything went wrong during his investigation. In it, he detailed his plans and the reasons behind them, ending with a challenge to his fellow executives. "We built this company to move humanity forward. It's time we proved we meant those words." As night fell, Marcus began his final transformation. He transferred a modest amount of cash to a prepaid debit card, enough to survive on a worker's wages, but not enough to provide an easy escape from the experience. His regular phones were powered down and stored in the hotel safe. From this moment until his investigation ended, he would live exactly as his workers lived. Looking in the mirror, Marcus barely recognized himself. The practiced confidence of a CEO had been replaced by the cautious uncertainty of someone on the economic edge. Tomorrow, he would step into a world he'd created but never truly understood. The weight of that responsibility, and the knowledge that thousands of lives depended on what he discovered, kept him awake long into the night. At 3:15 a.m., Marcus woke up in his reclined Honda Civic, his back already protesting the cramped sleeping arrangement. He'd parked in the lot of a 24-hour gym, one of the spots he'd overheard workers mentioning at the coffee shop. Around him, other cars showed signs of habitation, condensation on windows, subtle movements behind makeshift curtains, the occasional flash of a phone screen illuminating tired faces. The night had been anything but restful. Every passing car, every distant siren, every footstep had jolted him awake. The parking lot's harsh security lights penetrated his car's windows, and the ambient noise of the city never truly faded. He'd dozed fitfully, understanding for the first time why he'd seen so many workers buying energy drinks despite their meager wages. In the gym's bathroom, Marcus changed into his warehouse uniform, dark blue cargo pants, and a grey Swift Ship t-shirt he'd been issued during yesterday's orientation. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows under his eyes, emphasizing the stubble that had grown thicker over the past few days. Other men moved through the space with practiced efficiency, carrying toiletry bags and change of clothes. They hardly glanced at him. Just another worker preparing for another grinding day. "First day?" a voice asked as Marcus struggled with his locker. The speaker was an older man, with grey streaked hair, methodically arranging his belongings in a nearby locker. "Yeah," Marcus replied, maintaining his cover story. "Just moved from Nevada." The man nodded, introducing himself as Ray. "Word of advice. Get yourself a good pair of insoles. Concrete floors'll kill your feet otherwise." As they walked to their cars, Ray offered more tips. Which supervisors to avoid, which break rooms had working microwaves, where to find the least damaged pallet jacks. "Been doing this 20 years, Ray mentioned. 10 with Swift Ship. Used to have an apartment nearby, but rent went up again last month. Now home sweet home is a Nissan Sentra." He said it with a forced lightness that didn't quite mask the underlying bitterness. Marcus followed Ray's car to the warehouse, joining the steady stream of vehicles entering the massive parking lot. The pre-dawn air was cold and damp as workers hurried toward the entrance, many carrying thermoses of home-brewed coffee, another cost-saving measure he'd noticed. Near the building's entrance, a food truck was setting up, its prices notably higher than the same items at local stores. Another small indignity, charging premium prices to workers who had no other convenient options. The security check moved slowly as each worker passed through metal detectors and bag inspections. Marcus observed the subtle dynamics at play, how some guards were brusque and demanding, while others showed small kindnesses, like pretending not to notice forbidden phones or snacks. He recognized the security supervisor from his executive tours, but knew there was no risk of being identified. During those visits, he'd been just another suit walking through, barely noticed by the staff. Orientation had covered the basics. Safety protocols, productivity expectations, break schedules, but it hadn't mentioned the unwritten rules Marcus was now learning from his fellow workers. Don't use the break room microwave between 7 and 8 a.m. That's when the night shift needs it most. Avoid the south entrance during shift changes. The security guard there's too zealous with bag checks. Park facing out if you're sleeping. In your car makes it easier to leave if security hassles you. Inside the warehouse, the morning shift gathered for their pre-work meeting. The supervisor, a woman named Chen, no relation to his cover identity, rattled off productivity, targets, and safety reminders. Marcus stood with the other new hires, trying to blend in while observing everything. The returning workers showed varying levels of fatigue, some swaying slightly on their feet, others leaning against shelving units for support. "Remember," Sarah concluded, "we're running a special promotion this week, double points for exceeding your targets." The reward point system had been Marcus's idea years ago, intended to gamify the work and boost morale. Now he watched as workers exchanged knowing looks. Later, he'd learned that many traded their reward points for basic necessities like gas cards and grocery vouchers. The game had become a survival strategy. Ray appeared at his side as the meeting dispersed. "You're with me today, rookie," he said. They always pair new guys with veterans. Marcus followed him into the maze of shelving units, noting how Ray moved with the efficient precision of someone who'd learned to conserve every ounce of energy. Each step, each reach, each movement was calculated to minimize strain over a 12-hour shift. As they began their work, Marcus felt the weight of his decision to go undercover. He wasn't just here to observe the housing crisis. He needed to understand the entire ecosystem that had made it possible for one of the world's most successful companies to have workers sleeping in their cars. The physical demands of the job, the psychological toll of constant surveillance, the subtle hierarchies among workers and managers, it was all connected. His hands, soft from years of keyboard work, already ached from handling boxes. His legs protested the constant walking, yet around him, people who lived in their cars worked tirelessly, meeting demanding quotas while carrying the additional burden of housing insecurity. Their resilience wasn't something to celebrate. It was evidence of a system that had forced them to adapt to unreasonable circumstances. The morning crawled forward, each hour bringing new insights and challenges. Marcus had just begun his journey into his workers' world, and already the experience was transforming his understanding of what it meant to be competitive in the modern economy. As he struggled to keep pace with Ray's efficient movements, he realized that his real education was just beginning. By mid-morning, Marcus's body screamed with unfamiliar aches. The scanner strapped to his wrist constantly beeped, tracking his every movement and productivity rate. Ray had shown him the basics, how to read location codes, the fastest routes between sections, the proper lifting technique, but the pace was relentless. Every completed task immediately generated another, the algorithm constantly optimizing their movements without regard for human limitations. During their first break, Ray led him to a quiet corner of the break room, away from the supervisor's usual patrol routes. "You're falling behind on picks," Ray mentioned quietly, showing him the performance metrics on his scanner. "They'll write you up if you don't hit at least 85% efficiency by end of day." Marcus stared at the numbers, remembering how proudly he'd announced the implementation of this tracking system to his board. Now he saw how it reduced human beings to data points. A group of workers huddled nearby, sharing a large pack of instant noodles. One woman, who introduced herself as Lisa, offered Marcus some coffee from her thermos. "First day's the hardest," she said sympathetically. "Well, physically. Mentally, it gets worse when you realize this is your life now." She'd been with Swiftship for 3 years, living in her SUV for the past 8 months after her rent jumped beyond her means. The break room conversation revealed a complex support network among the car-dwelling workers. They shared information about safe parking spots, warned each other about aggressive security patrols, and exchanged tips about staying warm or cool, depending on the season. Someone mentioned a website they used to find free shower facilities. Another discussed which gym memberships offered the best value for bathroom access and climate control. "You staying in your car too?" Lisa asked Marcus, noticing how intently he listened to their survival strategies. When he nodded, several workers chimed in with advice. "Planet Fitness is cheapest for showers," one offered. "Library's good for Wi-Fi and air conditioning," another added. "Just don't let corporate know you're living in the lot," a third warned. "They'll fire you for safety violations. Happened to Mike last month." The break ended too quickly, sending them back to their stations. Marcus struggled to maintain the demanding pace while processing everything he'd learned. The warehouse felt different now, not just a logistics hub, but an ecosystem where hundreds of people worked to exhaustion before retiring to their cars, only to return and do it all again tomorrow. Sarah Chen, the supervisor, appeared periodically to check on his progress. "Your scan rate's improving," she noted during one pass, "but you're still well below target. Try to pick up the pace." Her tone wasn't unkind, but Marcus detected the strain in her voice. Later, Ray explained that supervisors faced their own pressures. Their bonuses depended on their team's metrics, forcing them to push workers harder than they might want to. Around noon, Marcus made his first major mistake. Rushing to improve his numbers, he misscanned an item location, causing a small backlog in the system. Sarah appeared almost immediately, clipboard in hand. "That's a productivity violation," she said, clearly uncomfortable. "I have to write it up. 3 strikes and you're on probation." The warning would stay in his file for 6 months. Another policy he'd approved without understanding its impact on workers who couldn't afford even a single mistake. The afternoon dragged on endlessly. Marcus watched his co-workers closely, noting how they moved with practiced precision despite their exhaustion. Many showed signs of physical strain, limping slightly, rolling sore shoulders, flexing stiff hands. Yet they kept moving, kept scanning, kept lifting, kept... The alternative was unemployment, and with it the loss of even their meager ability to survive in their vehicles. During the second break, Ray shared more of his story. He'd worked in warehouses most of his life, making decent money, until automation and efficiency metrics changed everything. "Used to be you could take a minute to catch your breath," he explained. "Now the system knows if you pause for more than 30 seconds. They call it optimization, but they're optimizing us right into the ground." Marcus thought about the quarterly reports he'd celebrated, the efficiency gains that had impressed shareholders. Each percentage improvement in productivity had come at a human cost he'd never fully calculated. The algorithm didn't account for aging bodies, chronic pain, or the exhaustion of living in constant housing insecurity. Near the end of his shift, Marcus noticed something that hit him hard. A young worker was discreetly slipping packets of hand warmers to car-dwelling colleagues. "Temperature's dropping tonight," she whispered. These small acts of mutual aid were everywhere once you knew to look for them. Workers sharing food, covering for each other's bathroom breaks, warning about surprise inspections. They'd created their own support system because the company's official one had failed them. As the day wound down, Marcus's scanner showed his final metrics: 82% efficiency, 3 minor violations, 1 written warning. In the corporate world, these would be concerning performance indicators. Here, they were potential catastrophes for workers living on the edge. 1 bad review, 1 missed quota, 1 mistake could cascade into unemployment and homelessness beyond their current car-dwelling status. Leaving the warehouse, Marcus watched the shift change in progress. Tired workers trudging out while fresh ones marched in, the building swallowing them into its perpetual cycle of activity. His muscles ached, his feet throbbed, and the thought of spending another night in his car felt overwhelming. Yet this was just day one, and he knew he needed to experience more to truly understand the crisis he'd uncovered. What he'd seen today was just the surface of a much deeper problem, one that would require more than just policy changes to fix. 3 days into his undercover mission, Marcus witnessed the incident that would change everything. The morning had started normally enough, the usual quiet shuffle of exhausted workers entering the warehouse, the beeping of scanners, the mechanical whir of conveyor belts. But around 10 a.m., a commotion erupted near the break room. Lisa, the woman who'd shared her coffee with him on his first day, had collapsed. She lay crumpled beside her workstation, her scanner still beeping insistently for the next pick. Workers gathered around her as Chen, the supervisor, rushed over. "Give her space," Sarah ordered, kneeling beside Lisa's unconscious form. "Someone call medical." But before anyone could reach for a phone, Gregory Walsh, the warehouse manager, emerged from his office. "What's the hold-up here?" he demanded, pushing through the crowd. Marcus watched from nearby, his heart racing as he recognized Walsh. They'd met at several executive functions, though Walsh had never paid much attention to him. "She fainted," Sarah explained, still checking Lisa's vital signs. "She needs medical attention." Walsh's expression hardened. "Is she breathing?" When Sarah nodded, he continued, "Then she can wait for the on-site medic. No need to call an ambulance and risk our injury-free days record." He turned to the gathered workers. "Back to your stations, everyone. These numbers aren't going to hit themselves." Ray, who stood next to Marcus, muttered under his breath, "She's been sleeping in her car in this heatwave, probably hasn't eaten properly in days." Marcus felt his fingers curl into fists, watching as Walsh prioritized metrics over human welfare. A policy he himself had inadvertently encouraged through the bonus structure he'd approved. The on-site medic arrived several minutes later, by which time Lisa had regained consciousness. She tried to stand, insisting she could return to work, but swayed dangerously. "You need rest and fluids," the medic advised, but Walsh interrupted. "Again, if you can't continue your shift, we'll have to mark this as an unauthorized break," Walsh announced loudly. "That's automatic disciplinary action. 3 strikes, remember?" His voice carried across the now silent warehouse floor. "Your choice." Marcus stepped forward before he could stop himself. "She needs medical attention," he said, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "This isn't about strikes or metrics." Walsh turned, fixing him with a cold stare. "And you are?" "Mark Chang," Marcus replied, fighting to maintain his cover. "New hire. But that doesn't change the fact that treating workers this way is wrong." "Mr. Chang," Walsh's voice dripped with condescension, "you've been here, what, 3 days? Perhaps you don't understand how things work yet. We have protocols, productivity targets, standards to maintain. If someone can't meet those standards—" He let the threat hang in the air. Chen surprised everyone by speaking up. "Sir, I'll take responsibility for the productivity. Drop. We can redistribute Lisa's picks among the team." The supervisor's voice shook slightly, but she stood her ground. Walsh's face reddened. "Both of you are now on report," he snapped, pointing at Marcus and Sarah. "And you," he turned to Lisa, who had managed to sit up, "either get back to work or clock out. Your choice." Through tears of humiliation and fear, Lisa struggled to her feet. "I'll work," she whispered. Marcus watched in horror as she picked up her scanner with trembling hands. He knew why she couldn't risk clocking out. Missing half a day's pay could mean not affording gas, which could mean not making it to work tomorrow, which could mean losing her job entirely. The precarity of their situations forced impossible choices. The incident sparked immediate ripples through the warehouse. Workers returned to their tasks, but the atmosphere had changed. Conversations died when Walsh passed by. People moved. More quickly, more fearfully, their eyes down and shoulders tense. Marcus noticed how they avoided the break room, taking their rest periods at their stations instead, technically against policy, but safer than risking another confrontation. During lunch, Ray explained more about Walsh. "Been here 2 years," he said quietly. "Came from some consulting firm that specializes in optimization. And the first thing he did was remove the break room couches because people were supposedly sleeping on them during shifts." Ray's voice lowered further. Never occurred to him to ask why people were so exhausted they needed to sleep at work. The afternoon crawled by in a haze of tension. Marcus watched Lisa closely. She moved slowly, clearly still unwell, but kept working. The workers subtly helped her, taking on heavier items from her picks, creating small distractions when Walsh passed by so she could rest momentarily. This underground network of mutual support was all that stood between many workers and complete collapse. Near the end of the shift, Walsh called Marcus into his office. The room was cold, dominated by multiple monitors displaying real-time productivity metrics. "Mr. Chang," Walsh began, "your numbers are below target. You've disrupted warehouse operations, and you've questioned management decisions. Consider this your first and only warning. Step out of line again, and you're done." Marcus nodded silently while his mind raced. As CEO, he could fire Walsh instantly, but that wouldn't solve the systemic issues that had enabled someone like Walsh to rise to power in his company. The metrics-obsessed culture, the rigid policies, the prioritization of numbers over human dignity, all of it had grown under Marcus's watch, even if this wasn't what he'd intended. Leaving Walsh's office, Marcus made a decision. He needed more than just evidence of poor conditions. He needed to understand how his company's policies had created an environment where managers felt empowered to treat human beings as disposable resources. The path forward would require more than just firing one bad manager or adjusting a few policies. The entire system needed to change. That night, Marcus couldn't sleep despite his physical exhaustion. He sat in his parked Honda, watching the steady stream of workers coming and going during the shift change. The image of Lisa collapsing kept replaying in his mind, along with Walsh's callous response. The temperature had dropped significantly, and he noticed several workers hurrying between cars, distributing extra blankets and thermoses of hot coffee to their vehicle-dwelling colleagues. Using his cheap burner phone, he discreetly researched Gregory Walsh's hiring history. The consulting firm he'd come from specialized in workforce optimization, a euphemism for squeezing maximum productivity from workers while minimizing costs. Marcus remembered approving Walsh's hire based on impressive efficiency statistics from his previous positions. Now he understood the human cost behind those numbers. A knock on his car window startled him. It was Ray, holding 2 cups of convenience, store coffee. Marcus rolled down his window, accepting the offered drink gratefully. "Rough day," Ray said, leaning against the car. "Saw you standing up to Walsh. Brave, but stupid. He's gotten people fired for less." "What happened to Lisa?" Marcus asked, blowing on the hot coffee. "Sarah helped her find a spot in the lot closer to the building where there's better air circulation," Ray explained. "Some of us pooled money to get her some food and electrolyte drinks. She'll make it. She has to. Can't afford not to." He paused, studying Marcus's face. "You're different from most new hires. Most keep their heads down, try to stay invisible." Marcus struggled with how to respond, saved by another worker approaching, the young woman who'd been distributing. "And warm as the other day. Meeting in 15, she whispered to Ray. "Usual spot, spread the word." She glanced at Marcus uncertainly. "He's okay," Ray assured her. "He stood up to Walsh." The woman, Marcus learned her name was Jasmine, nodded slowly. "You should come too," she told Marcus. "If you're living the lot life, you need to know how things really work here." 15 minutes later, Marcus found himself in a dimly lit corner of a nearby park, joined by about 20 workers from various shifts. They sat in a loose circle, some on benches, others on the ground, all speaking in hushed voices, despite being far from the warehouse. Sarah Chen was there too, still in her supervisor's vest. Today was a wake-up call, Jasmine began, clearly a leader in this informal group. Walsh is getting more aggressive with write-ups and disciplinary actions. People are working sick, working injured, afraid to take legally mandated breaks. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the group. Corporate doesn't care, someone called. Out. They just want their numbers. That's not entirely true, Sarah interjected. I tried reporting some of this through official channels. The responses are always the same. They quote policy about competitive wages and benefits, remind us about the open door policy, but nothing changes. It's like they live in a different reality. Marcus felt each word like a physical blow. He had written many of those policies genuinely believing they would protect workers. Now he saw how they'd become weapons of control, used to maintain a system that prioritized efficiency over humanity. We need to do something, Lisa spoke up, her voice still weak. She sat wrapped in a blanket someone had brought her. Not just for ourselves, but for everyone who might end up here. Nobody should have to choose between working while sick or losing their home, even if that home is just a car. The group began discussing options, everything from formal complaints to labor organizations. Marcus listened intently, realizing that this shadow network of mutual aid had evolved into something more, a community of resistance, fighting not just for survival, but for dignity. The real problem, Ray observed, is that nobody at the top sees this. They visit for scheduled tours, everything gets cleaned up, everyone smiles and nods. They don't see us sleeping in our cars, don't see people passing out from exhaustion, don't see managers like Walsh threatening people's livelihoods over basic human needs. A young man Marcus hadn't met before spoke up. My sister works in tech, says companies there have all these amenities, free food, rest areas, wellness programs. Meanwhile, we get written up for sitting down between pics. The contrast was stark, and Marcus felt the weight of his own complicity. He had approved premium benefits for corporate staff, while warehouse workers struggled to survive. The meeting continued for another hour, with workers sharing stories and strategies. They organized informal schedules for watching each other's cars during sleep periods, coordinated food sharing to help those running low on funds, and planned responses to Walsh's increasingly harsh policies. Marcus realized he was witnessing something remarkable, a parallel support system born from necessity, filling the gaps left by official company policies. As the meeting broke up, Jasmine pulled Marcus aside. Walsh will be watching you now, she warned. After today, you're on his radar. Be careful. Her concern was genuine, and Marcus felt a deep sense of shame. These workers looked out for each other, while the company he built treated them as disposable resources. Walking back to his car, Marcus made detailed notes about everything he'd learned. The problem went deeper than housing or wages. It was about power, dignity, and the fundamental disconnect between corporate policies and human realities. His workers had built an incredible support network, but they shouldn't have had to. The company should have protected them, supported them, valued them as human beings rather than data points on a productivity chart. As he settled in for another uncomfortable night in his car, Marcus began drafting plans for systemic change. But first, he needed to document everything. Walsh's abuse of power, the workers' hidden struggles, the failure of corporate policies to protect the most vulnerable. The truth needed to be undeniable, the evidence overwhelming. Only then could he hope to transform Swiftship into the company he'd originally envisioned, one that truly moved humanity forward, starting with its own workers. The next morning brought an unexpected development that shook the warehouse. Walsh had implemented a new security measure: random vehicle inspections in the parking lot. Marcus watched from his car as security guards moved through the rows of vehicles, clipboard in hand, documenting any signs of overnight stays. The message was clear: Walsh was retaliating against the car-dwelling workers. "He's trying to smoke us out," Ray muttered during their morning break. The break room was unusually crowded as workers huddled together, sharing information about the inspections. 3 people already got written up for unauthorized use of company property, basically for sleeping in their cars. They're saying it's a liability issue. Sarah Chen pulled Marcus and Ray aside, her face tense. "Walsh called a supervisor meeting this morning. We're supposed to start tracking signs of fatigue and document anyone who looks like they're sleeping on site. He's creating a paper trail to justify terminations." Her hands shook slightly as she spoke. "I can't do it. These are people's lives we're talking about." The warehouse floor buzzed with nervous energy. Workers moved faster, jumped at every sound, their fear palpable. Marcus noticed Lisa working, despite still looking ill, her movements mechanical as she forced herself to maintain pace. The scanner at her wrist beeped constantly, measuring every second of productivity with cold precision. During lunch, Jasmine organized an emergency meeting in a secluded corner of the warehouse. "We need options," she whispered to the gathered group. "Some people have nowhere else to go. The nearest affordable housing is 2 hours away. Nobody can commute that far on our wages." A younger worker named Kevin spoke up. "My cousin works at the North Valley warehouse, says they're having the same problems there. Management's cracking down on car dwellers, pushing impossible quotas, ignoring safety concerns." This caught Marcus's attention. He hadn't considered that these issues might extend beyond this location. "What about the media?" someone suggested. "If people knew how we're living, they'd fire us all and hire new people," another worker countered. "There's always someone desperate enough to take the job." Marcus listened intently, his mind racing. He'd chosen this warehouse for his investigation because of the online complaints, but Kevin's comment about North Valley suggested a broader pattern. He pulled out his phone, carefully searching for news about other swift ship facilities while maintaining his cover. What he found shocked him. Similar stories were emerging across the country. Workers living in vehicles, aggressive. Management tactics, increasing automation, pushing people to their physical limits. The system he'd built had replicated its worst features everywhere, creating a nationwide crisis hidden behind efficiency metrics and productivity reports. Later that afternoon, Walsh assembled the entire shift for an announcement. "Due to recent events," he began, his voice carrying across the silent warehouse, "we're implementing new performance standards. Anyone falling below 95% efficiency will be subject to immediate review. Additionally, the parking lot is company property. Using it for anything other than parking during your scheduled shift is grounds for termination." Marcus watched the color drain from faces around him. The current average efficiency rate was barely 90%. Walsh was creating impossible standards, giving himself the power to fire almost anyone at will. The strategy was clear: force out the car-dwelling workers without explicitly targeting their housing status. During the afternoon shift, Marcus witnessed the immediate impact of Walsh's new policies. A worker named Michael, who'd been living in his car for 3 months, was called into the office. He emerged 30 minutes later, badge in hand, eyes downcast. "Failed to maintain required productivity levels," he muttered as he passed the group. Everyone knew the real reason. He'd been spotted organizing sleeping arrangements in the parking lot. The termination sent shockwaves through the warehouse. Workers began clearing personal items from their cars, trying to hide any evidence that they lived there. Some discussed finding new parking spots miles away, adding lengthy walks to their already exhausting days. Others wondered if they could afford to split motel rooms, cramming multiple people into single beds to share costs. Sarah approached Marcus during a quiet moment between picks. "Something bigger is happening," she whispered. "Walsh has been on conference calls all day with other warehouse managers. This isn't just about us anymore. It's becoming company policy." The revelation hit Marcus hard. As CEO, he'd always trusted his management team to implement policies fairly, to treat workers with dignity. Instead, they'd created a system of systematic oppression, using his emphasis on efficiency and productivity as justification for pushing people to the breaking point. Near the end of the shift, Marcus overheard Walsh on the phone in his office. "Yes, sir, we're implementing the new standards. No, we haven't had any direct pushback. Yes, productivity is already improving. We expect to see significant changes in the workforce composition within weeks." The clinical discussion of what amounted to forced displacement of vulnerable workers made Marcus's blood boil. He'd started this investigation to understand a housing crisis, but he'd uncovered something far more sinister, a coordinated effort to push out workers who couldn't maintain impossible standards, who couldn't afford to live in increasingly expensive areas, who dared to support each other in the face of corporate pressure. As he left the warehouse that evening, Marcus made a decision. One facility wasn't enough. He needed to see if this was truly systematic. He would use his remaining time to visit other warehouses, to document the full scope of the crisis. The problem wasn't just one bad manager or one expensive city. It was a fundamental flaw in how SwiftShip treated its most vulnerable workers. A flaw that he had unknowingly helped create. The story broke on social media first. A TikTok video, shakily filmed through a car window, showed the early morning routine at the SwiftShip warehouse. Dozens of workers emerging from their vehicles, gathering their belongings, heading to the gym for quick showers before their shifts. The caption read, "This is where your next day deliveries really come from." SwiftShip workers living in their cars because they can't afford rent. Marcus discovered the viral post during his lunch break, huddled in his car to escape Walsh's increasingly watchful eye. The video had already accumulated millions of views, with thousands of comments expressing shock and outrage. Former SwiftShip workers began sharing their own stories in the comments, creating a damning picture of systemic worker exploitation. His burner phone buzzed with a text from Bianca, his assistant. "Major crisis brewing, video exposing worker conditions going viral, board demanding emergency meeting. Where are you?" Marcus ignored it, knowing he needed to see how this would play out on the ground level first. Inside the warehouse, the atmosphere grew tenser by the hour. Workers whispered about the video between picks, some worried about retaliation, others hoping this exposure might finally force changes. Walsh stalked the floor, his face dark with barely contained anger, documenting every minor infraction with aggressive intensity. "They're saying there's news vans outside," Ray mentioned quietly during their afternoon break. "Corporate sent some PR team to handle it, but they can't stop people from filming the parking lot from the public street." Through the break room windows, Marcus could see several vehicles with satellite dishes parked along the perimeter of the property. Sarah Chen called an emergency supervisor meeting, her usual composure cracking under the pressure. "Corporate wants us to direct all media inquiries to the PR team," she announced, reading from an email on her phone. "We're supposed to remind workers about the social media policy and non-disclosure agreements they signed during hiring." But the story had already outgrown SwiftShip's ability to contain it. A local news helicopter circled overhead, capturing aerial footage of the parking lot. Investigative reporters began reaching out to current and former employees. Someone had leaked internal documents showing productivity metrics and wage scales, revealing how the company's efficiency algorithms pushed workers to physical extremes. while keeping compensation barely above minimum wage. During the afternoon shift, a new wave of social media posts appeared, this time featuring Walsh's recent crackdown. Shaky smartphone videos showed security guards performing vehicle inspections, workers being escorted out after termination, the new policy announcements. Each post added fuel to the growing outrage. "They can't fire all of us," Jasmine declared, during a hasty gathering near the loading docks. "If this story keeps spreading, they'll have to make changes." But her voice carried more hope than conviction. Everyone had seen how quickly Walsh had disposed of workers who dared to speak up. Marcus watched as corporate damage control kicked into high gear. A mass email went out to all employees, promising a comprehensive review of housing assistance, programs, and a renewed commitment to worker welfare. The language was polished, professional, and completely divorced from the reality he'd been living for the past week. Lisa, still recovering from her collapse but unable to risk missing, work showed him the email on her phone. "Look at this," she said bitterly. "Competitive wages and comprehensive benefits. They really think we're living in our cars by choice." The contrast between corporate messaging and ground-level reality was stark, another failure of leadership that Marcus would have to address when this was over. By end of shift, the story had reached national news outlets. "Silicon Valley's hidden homeless, the tech economy's shadow workforce," read one headline. "Swift ships human cost, workers sleep in cars while company posts record profits," declared another. The company's stock price had dropped 15% in a single day. In the parking lot, a scene unfolded that captured the surreal nature of the moment. As workers headed to their cars, many of which doubled as their homes, they passed a group of corporate representatives in suits, standing awkwardly near the entrance with prepared statements about SwiftShip's commitment to worker welfare. The representatives looked uncomfortable, avoiding eye contact with the workers who would soon be sleeping just feet away from where they stood. Marcus's phone continued buzzing with messages from increasingly panicked executives. The board was threatening emergency measures, shareholders were demanding answers, and his absence had become a major point of concern. But as he watched his workers navigate this crisis, supporting each other, sharing resources, standing together despite the risks, he knew he couldn't step in yet. The story needed to play out fully. The truth needed to be completely exposed. A final image caught his attention before he settled in for another night in his car. Someone had taped a sign to the warehouse entrance featuring SwiftShip's corporate slogan, "Moving Humanity Forward," with a bitter addition underneath. One homeless worker at a time. The photo was already circulating online, becoming a symbol of the disconnect between corporate promises and worker realities. As darkness fell, Marcus made more detailed notes about everything he'd witnessed. The viral exposure of worker conditions wasn't just a PR crisis. It was an opportunity for genuine change if handled correctly. But first, he needed to understand how his workers would weather this storm, how management would react, and whether the public attention would help or hurt those already struggling to survive. The North Valley facility sat 40 miles away, a sprawling complex that employed over 1,000 workers. Marcus arrived before dawn, having driven through the night after his shift ended at Oakland. The viral story had forced him to accelerate his investigation. He needed to confirm whether Walsh's management style was an anomaly or part of a broader pattern. This warehouse looked different from the outside. Newer, more automated, with sleek architectural touches that had earned it coverage in business magazines. But the parking lot told the same story. Scattered vehicles showing signs of habitation, workers hurrying through morning routines while trying to remain inconspicuous. Marcus counted at least 30 cars with telltale signs of being lived in. Covered windows, organized storage, people changing clothes in back seats. He'd arranged this visit through the temporary staffing agency SwiftShip used for peak periods, allowing him to bypass the usual hiring process. His orientation group included 5 others, all looking worn down before they'd even started. A woman named Teresa had visible grey roots in her hair and wore clothes that had seen better days. Next to her, a young man named Andre bounced nervously, checking his watch repeatedly. Their orientation leader, assistant manager David Powell, delivered his speech with mechanical efficiency. "SwiftShip is experiencing some negative attention right now," he acknowledged. "But don't let social media drama distract you from your duties. We reward productivity and reliability. Stay focused on your metrics and you'll do fine here." The underlying message was clear. Keep your head down. Don't ask questions. Don't become another viral story. Marcus noticed security cameras had been installed in new locations around the facility, a recent addition based on their pristine appearance. The company was battening down the hatches, preparing for increased scrutiny. Their first assignment was in the packing department, where automated systems had replaced many human workers. Those who remained rushed to keep pace with machines, their movements precise and hurried. A supervisor named Karen Matthews watched from a raised platform, calling out warnings to anyone who fell behind the automated pace. "Systems running at 98% efficiency today," Karen announced proudly to Powell during his inspection walk. "We've managed to reduce human error by another 2% this quarter." Neither seemed to notice the cost of that efficiency. Workers massaging cramped hands, trying to match the relentless rhythm of machines designed to operate without breaks or fatigue. During their first break, Marcus found himself next to Andre in the break room. The young man's hands shook as he tried to open a protein bar. "Can't afford to mess this up," he muttered, more to himself than to Marcus. "Got a baby on the way, living in my cousin's garage right now. Need this job to last at least until we can save first and last month's rent somewhere." Teresa joined them, moving stiffly from hours of repetitive motions. "They're pushing harder than usual," she observed. "All this media attention has them scared. They're trying to prove the complaints wrong by showing how efficient everything is." She'd worked at 3 different SwiftShip facilities over 2 years, moving whenever rising rents forced her to seek cheaper areas. The conversation was interrupted by Karen's arrival. "Breaks are 15 minutes exactly," she reminded them sharply. "The system logs any delays in returning to stations." She paused, looking directly at Marcus. "Mr. Chang, your scan rate is 5% below target. I suggest using your break time to review proper scanning techniques." Marcus watched her leave, noting how other workers had tensed at her approach. This facility might look more modern than Oakland, but the underlying dynamics were identical. Automated systems setting impossible standards, managers prioritizing metrics over humanity, workers struggling to survive on wages that couldn't cover basic housing. A news alert popped up on the breakroom's TV. "SwiftShip crisis deepens. Similar conditions reported at multiple facilities." The screen showed footage from various warehouses across the country, including shots of workers sleeping in their cars. Karen quickly changed the channel, but not before Marcus noticed Teresa and Andre exchanging knowing looks. Back on the floor, Marcus observed how the automation had changed worker behavior. Unlike Oakland's more traditional warehouse setup, here people competed with machines. The automated system set the pace, and humans were expected to match it, or face consequences. It was efficiency taken to its logical extreme, and its human cost was devastating. During lunch, he overheard a conversation between Powell and another manager, discussing new corporate directives. "They want us to identify any potential troublemakers," Powell explained quietly. "Anyone who might talk to the media or post online. Document everything. Tardiness, efficiency drops, any sign of fatigue or unauthorized breaks." The systematic nature of the response chilled Marcus. Instead of addressing the underlying issues, corporate leadership was focusing on controlling the narrative and silencing potential whistleblowers. The same pattern was probably repeating at every facility, a coordinated effort to maintain the illusion of efficiency and success while workers suffered in silence. Near the end of his shift, Marcus witnessed a scene that confirmed his worst fears. A worker collapsed, much like Lisa had in Oakland, but here the response was even more callous. The automated system continued running as medical assistance was called, and other workers were ordered to maintain their pace. The system can't stop, Karen announced. Adjust your routes around Station 42 until medical clears the area. Standing there, watching the endless flow of products while a human being lay unconscious on the floor, Marcus understood that the crisis went deeper than housing. The entire system had been optimized for packages rather than people, treating human beings as components that could be replaced when they wore out. Every facility, regardless of its outward appearance or level of automation, operated on the same fundamental disregard for human dignity. As he left the North Valley warehouse that evening, Marcus knew he had seen enough. The viral story hadn't exposed an isolated problem. It had cracked the veneer on a nationwide crisis of his own making. His company's relentless pursuit of efficiency had created a system that was fundamentally hostile to human needs, and changing it would require more than just policy adjustments or PR statements. Back at the Oakland facility the next day, Marcus found the warehouse transformed by the growing media attention. Corporate had sent a team of consultants to address worker concerns, but their presence only highlighted the disconnect between management and workers. The consultants, dressed in crisp business attire, conducted structured interviews in glass-walled offices, while workers rushed to maintain their quotas on the floor below. Chen was caught in the middle, trying to balance corporate demands with her workers' needs. Marcus watched as she navigated a particularly telling interaction. A consultant had demanded she provide lists of potentially problematic employees, those who might speak to the media. Instead, Sarah carefully compiled a report highlighting system glitches and equipment issues, protecting her team while appearing to comply. "They don't understand," she confided to Marcus during a quiet moment. "These consultants keep talking about corporate culture and employee engagement, but they haven't asked a single question about why people can't afford housing on their wages." Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted her supervisor's tablet. "Yesterday, they suggested team-building exercises to improve morale. Team-building exercises for people sleeping in their cars." Vidi, the contrast between Sarah's approach and Walsh's became starker as the day progressed. While Sarah worked to shield her team from corporate scrutiny, Walsh seemed energized by the presence of the consultants. He led them on carefully choreographed tours, showcasing the warehouse's efficiency metrics while avoiding areas where workers struggled to keep pace. "Notice our advanced tracking systems," Walsh boasted to the consultants, pointing to the screens displaying worker movements. "Every action is optimized for maximum productivity." He failed to mention how these same systems forced workers to skip bathroom breaks or risk missing their quotas. The consultants nodded approvingly, typing notes on their tablets. Ray had developed his own subtle resistance. Marcus observed how the veteran worker had organized an informal support network, teaching new hires like himself how to meet quotas while preserving their health. "Keep your core tight when lifting," he'd advise, or "take the long route between picks. Looks less efficient on paper but saves your joints in the long run." Lisa, still recovering from her collapse but unable to take time off, represented yet another approach to survival. She'd learned to game the system, timing her movements to create small pockets of rest while maintaining acceptable metrics. The workers covered for her when she needed brief breaks, creating a human shield against the algorithm's relentless demands. The consultant's presence created an unexpected divide among the workforce. Some, desperate to keep their jobs, adopted Walsh's performance of contentment and efficiency. Others, like Jasmine, became more determined to expose the truth. The tension between these groups added another layer of stress to an already charged atmosphere. A new character emerged during the afternoon shift, Regina Foster, the lead consultant, who approached Marcus during his break. "We've noticed you're relatively new here," she said, her tone carefully neutral. "We'd love to hear your fresh perspective on the facility's operations." The invitation was clear. Become an informant, report on your colleagues, secure your position. Marcus watched other workers receive similar approaches throughout the day. Some agreed to private interviews, emerging with worried expressions and avoiding eye contact with their colleagues. Others refused, knowing it would mark them as troublemakers, but unwilling to compromise their principles. Jasmine organized another covert meeting during lunch, this time in the far corner of the parking lot. "They're trying to divide us," she warned the gathered workers, offering special treatment to anyone who helps them contain the story. Her words carried extra weight now that the media spotlight had made their situation national news. The most striking contrast emerged during an afternoon incident. A worker named James had received news that his car, his home, would be repossessed. Unable to focus, his productivity dropped below acceptable levels. Walsh moved to write him up immediately, but Sarah intervened. "He's been here 3 years, Sarah argued, standing between Walsh and James. "His metrics were perfect until today. We can redistribute his picks, give him time to sort this out." Other supervisors watched the confrontation, their own management styles being put to the test in this moment of crisis. Walsh's response was telling. "The system doesn't care about personal problems," he snapped. "Either he meets his quotas or he doesn't. It's that simple." The exchange exemplified the fundamental divide in management approaches. Those who saw workers as human beings and those who treated them as interchangeable parts in a machine. Even among the corporate consultants, divisions appeared. A younger consultant named Michael Patel lingered after his official interviews, asking workers quiet questions about their living situations and noting their answers with growing concern. His reports, Marcus would later learn, differed significantly from his colleagues, highlighting systemic issues rather than individual performance metrics. As the day wound down, the warehouse had become a microcosm of competing philosophies. About worker treatment, Sarah and her allies worked to protect their teams while appearing to comply with corporate demands. Walsh and his supporters doubled down on efficiency and control. Workers like Ray and Jasmine built networks of mutual support, while others sought individual salvation through compliance. Marcus documented each interaction, each contrasting approach to the crisis. The solution wouldn't be as simple as firing the bad managers and promoting the good ones. The entire system needed restructuring to reward humanity over efficiency, cooperation over competition, dignity over data points. The question was whether such a transformation was possible in a company built on the premise of maximum productivity at minimum cost. The story exploded beyond containment on day 8 of Marcus's investigation. A major news network aired an in-depth segment featuring hidden camera footage from multiple Swift ship facilities, including shots of workers sleeping in their cars, rushing through morning routines at public restrooms, and struggling to maintain the punishing pace set by the automated systems. Marcus watched the coverage on his phone during lunch, surrounded by other workers in their cars. The break room had become too tense with consultants hovering nearby. The report included interviews with former employees, internal documents showing impossible productivity targets, and damning statistics about the gap between Swiftship's profits and worker wages. His burner phone buzzed constantly with messages from Bianca, Board calling emergency meetings. Stock down 30%. Major clients threatening to cancel contracts. Where are you? The crisis was spiraling beyond anything he'd anticipated. SwiftShip's carefully cultivated image as a progressive tech company was crumbling in real time. Inside the warehouse, the atmosphere crackled with nervous energy. Corporate had sent more than consultants now. A team of lawyers moved through the facility, having workers sign updated non-disclosure agreements. Just routine paperwork, they claimed, but the timing wasn't lost on anyone. They're trying to plug leaks that have already burst, Ray observed during a brief conversation between picks. But they don't realize we're not the ones they need to worry about anymore. The whole world is watching now. He was right. Social media had latched onto the story, with hashtags like Swift Ship Shame and Car Dwelling Crisis trending nationwide. Influencers were filming themselves cancelling Swift Ship subscriptions. Competitors seized the opportunity, announcing increased wages and housing assistance programs for their own workers. Sarah Chen pulled Marcus aside during the afternoon shift, her face tense. "Corporates demanding lists of everyone who's been living in their cars," she whispered. "They're calling it a security audit, but Walsh is already talking about mass terminations. He says we need to clean house before the media attention brings government investigators." The pressure from above was mounting by the hour. A new memo arrived from corporate headquarters announcing mandatory communication training sessions for all employees. The underlying message was clear. Don't talk to the media, don't post on social media, don't do anything to feed the growing scandal. But it was too late for damage control. A local news crew had set up across the street, filming workers arriving and leaving. Housing advocates arrived with pamphlets about tenants' rights and worker protection laws. Union organizers appeared at the edges of the property, despite security's efforts to keep them away. The viral story had taken on a life of its own. Workers from other companies began sharing similar experiences online. The conversation expanded beyond SwiftShip to encompass the broader crisis of working poverty in the tech economy. Politicians seized on the moment, calling for investigations into labor practices across the industry. Marcus's phone lit up with a news alert. A federal labor investigation had been launched into SwiftShip's practices. The Department of Labor announced they would be examining working conditions, wage policies, and potential labor law violations at all major facilities. The pressure cooker atmosphere inside the warehouse intensified. Walsh stormed through the facility, documenting every minor infraction. The corporate consultants huddled in glass-walled offices, their expressions growing more concerned with each new development. Workers moved quickly and quietly, trying to avoid drawing attention while wondering if each shift would be their last. Jasmine organized another emergency meeting, this time in the parking lot of a nearby diner after their shift. The group had grown larger, now including workers from other shifts and even a few from neighboring facilities. "They're going to try to make examples of some of us," she warned. "We need to stick together, document everything, protect each other." The survival networks that workers had built began to evolve into something more organized. They shared contact information, created emergency support plans, discussed legal rights. Those who had cars offered shelter to others who might lose their parking lot homes. It was solidarity born of necessity, but it carried the seeds of real collective action. A new wave of media requests flooded in. National morning shows, documentary filmmakers, investigative journalists. Each wanted to tell the story of SwiftShip's car-dwelling workers, to expose the dark side of the convenience economy. The company's PR team seemed overwhelmed, issuing contradictory statements about investigating concerns while simultaneously defending their labor practices. Marcus watched as his carefully built corporate edifice began to crack under the weight of exposed truth. The efficiency metrics he'd championed, the optimization algorithms he'd approved, the productivity targets he'd celebrated, all were being revealed as tools of worker exploitation. The question was no longer whether Swiftship would change, but how dramatic that change would need to be. Late that evening, as workers prepared for another night in their cars, a new development sent shockwaves through the facility. A major tech news site published an article claiming that Swiftship's CEO had disappeared during the biggest crisis in company history. The piece questioned Marcus's leadership and suggested the board might need to take emergency action. The irony of his own absence becoming part of the story wasn't lost on Marcus. As he settled into his car for another uncomfortable night, he realized the situation had grown far beyond his original investigation. What had started as an attempt to understand a housing crisis had evolved into a national conversation about worker dignity, corporate responsibility, and the human cost of consumer convenience. The question was, when he finally revealed himself, would he be able to implement the sweeping changes needed to address not just the symptoms, but the root causes of the crisis? The South Bay facility represented Swiftship's newest innovation in warehouse design, a showcase of automation and efficiency that the company had proudly unveiled just 6 months ago. Marcus arrived for his third undercover assignment amid unprecedented security measures. The viral crisis had prompted management to install additional cameras, hire more guards, and implement strict new entry protocols. The facility itself was a marvel of modern logistics. Robotic arms swung overhead, autonomous vehicles zipped along programmed paths, and AI systems coordinated it all with precision. But beneath the technological gloss, Marcus quickly discovered the same human crisis he'd witnessed at the other locations. His temporary assignment here placed him in the quality control department, working alongside Elena Rodriguez, a former tech worker who'd lost her IT job during industry layoffs. "Welcome to the future," she said sarcastically, gesturing at the robots moving packages around them. "Too bad the future doesn't pay enough to live in it." The South Bay location had its own unique version of the housing crisis. Many workers commuted 2 or 3 hours each way from cheaper areas, while others lived in overcrowded apartments closer to the facility. The parking lot showed fewer signs of car dwelling, not because workers were better housed, but because local ordinances aggressively targeted vehicle residents. The facility's manager, Victoria Hammond, represented a new breed of tech-focused leadership. She spoke constantly about optimization and efficiency, using terms like human-robot collaboration and algorithmic workforce management. But her polished corporate language couldn't hide the underlying reality. Workers were treated as biological components in a mechanical system. "Your biosignals indicate elevated stress levels," a supervisor informed a worker who'd slowed down during his shift. "The system recommends a 3-minute breathing exercise before resuming optimal performance." The suggestion wasn't optional. It was logged and tracked like every other metric in the worker's file. During his lunch break, Marcus witnessed a scene that crystallized everything wrong with the system. A worker named James Chen, no relation, received news that his elderly mother had fallen ill. He requested emergency leave, but the automated scheduling system denied it based on staffing algorithms. When he appealed to Hammond, her response was pure corporate efficiency. "The system optimizes staffing based on historical data and current demands," she explained without emotion. "It indicates that allowing unscheduled leave during peak hours creates unacceptable disruption to workflow patterns. Perhaps you could explore our shift exchange program." The human cost of this automated management style became clearer throughout the day. Workers moved like automatons, their actions dictated by algorithms that didn't account for fatigue, stress, or personal circumstances. The system tracked their movements with microsecond precision, generating warnings for even minor deviations from optimal patterns. Elena showed Marcus the break room's wellness pod, a small booth where workers could take mandatory relaxation breaks when their productivity metrics showed signs of decline. "They track our stress levels, but never ask what's causing them," she explained. "Like maybe it's the fact that I share a one-bedroom apartment with 3 other people because rent here is more than my monthly salary." The facility's advanced technology had created new forms of pressure. Workers wore biosensor bands that monitored their physical state, ostensibly for safety, but really to maximize productivity. AI systems analyzed their movements, suggesting more efficient ways to perform tasks that often ignored human ergonomics and comfort. During the afternoon shift, Marcus observed a team meeting where Hammond presented new productivity goals. The targets were based on theoretical maximums calculated by AI, with no consideration for human limitations. Workers exchanged knowing looks as she spoke about pushing the boundaries of human potential. "The system has identified optimal performance patterns," Hammond announced, showing charts on a large screen. "By analyzing top performers, we've established new baseline expectations for all workers." She didn't mention that these top performers often sacrificed their health to maintain such speeds, or that many of them had already quit due to burnout. The contrast between the facility's technological sophistication and its human failings became starker as the day progressed. While robots moved with perfect precision overhead, workers below struggled with basic needs. Marcus overheard conversations about shared housing arrangements, long commutes, and the constant stress of living paycheck to paycheck in one of the country's most expensive regions. A young worker named David Park collapsed during his shift, his biosensor showing dangerous levels of dehydration and fatigue. The system automatically rerouted work around his station while medical assistance was called, but Hammond's first concern was updating the efficiency metrics to account for the disruption. "We'll need to adjust the algorithm to better predict human performance degradation," she told her supervisors, treating the incident as a data point rather than a human crisis. "Perhaps we can implement preemptive shift adjustments based on biometric trending." Near the end of his shift, Marcus received his own automated warning. His productivity had dropped below optimal levels, and the system had flagged him for performance intervention. The message on his scanner was cold and clear. "Your current efficiency rating suggests potential unsuitability for this role. Please report to HR for evaluation." The South Bay facility represented everything Marcus had once thought was progress: cutting-edge technology, data-driven management, maximum efficiency. But his time there revealed how this vision of the future had lost sight of human dignity. The advanced systems that were supposed to make work easier had instead created new ways to push people beyond their limits. As he left the facility that evening, Marcus made his final notes. The crisis wasn't just about housing or wages. It was about a fundamental misunderstanding of what it meant to be human in an increasingly automated world. His company had built a system that prioritized packages over people, data over dignity, and efficiency over humanity. The viral exposure of workers sleeping in cars had revealed just one symptom of a much deeper problem. Everything came to a head on the morning Marcus returned to the Oakland facility. The parking lot was filled with news vans, their satellite dishes raised like mechanical forests. Housing advocates had set up information tables along the public sidewalk, while union organizers distributed flyers despite security's attempts to move them along. The crisis had reached its boiling point. Inside, Walsh had called an emergency all-hands meeting. The warehouse floor fell silent as workers gathered, tension thick in the air. Marcus stood between Ray and Lisa, noting how everyone seemed to be bracing for bad news. Walsh's face was flushed with barely contained anger as he addressed the crowd. In light of recent events and unauthorized media communications, Walsh began, his voice clipped. Corporate has authorized immediate policy changes. First, effective immediately, any employee found to be living in their vehicle on company property will be terminated for violation of security protocols. Second, all workers must sign new non-disclosure agreements by end of shift today. Refusal to sign will be considered voluntary resignation. The announcement sent shockwaves through the assembled workers. Marcus watched faces pale, hands tremble, desperate glances exchanged. These weren't just policy changes, they were effective eviction notices for dozens of workers who had nowhere else to go. Chen stepped forward, her voice shaking, but determined. These people need time to find alternative arrangements. You can't just force them out with no notice. Other supervisors nodded in agreement, but Walsh's expression hardened. This isn't a negotiation, he snapped. The company's reputation is at stake. Anyone who doesn't like the new policies is free to seek employment elsewhere. His eyes swept the crowd, lingering on known car dwellers. Security will begin parking lot inspections at midnight. Plan accordingly. The meeting dissolved into chaos. Workers huddled in small groups, many fighting back tears. Some began calling friends or family, desperately seeking temporary housing. Others simply stood in shocked silence, the reality of their situation sinking in. Jasmine tried to organize an immediate protest, but fear had fractured the workforce. We can't let them do this, she urged, but many workers just shook their heads. With the media spotlight on them, some feared being blacklisted from future employment if they spoke up. The corporate consultants moved through the facility like sharks, pulling workers aside for confidential interviews that felt more like interrogations. Marcus overheard one consultant pressing a young worker about who had leaked information to the press, promising protection in exchange for names. Around noon, the situation escalated further. Federal labor investigators arrived, armed with warrants, to inspect records and interview workers. Walsh retreated to his office, emerging only to huddle with the legal team that had been dispatched from corporate headquarters. The warehouse floor became a battleground of competing interests: investigators, consultants, managers, and increasingly desperate workers. Lisa collapsed again, this time from the stress of knowing she'd lose both her job and her makeshift home in the parking lot. As medical attention was called, Marcus watched Walsh documenting the incident with barely concealed satisfaction. Another problem worker who would be easy to dismiss. Ray, who'd lived in his car for over 6 months, approached Marcus during their break. "Some of us are talking about a walkout," he confided. "Better to quit on our terms than wait for them to force us out. But others can't afford to lose even a day's pay." The impossible choice facing workers: stand up for their rights or protect their survival, highlighted the cruel efficiency of the system. Chen made one last attempt to reason with Walsh, bringing him data showing how many workers would be affected by the new policies. "These numbers represent real people," she argued. "Families, elderly parents, single mothers. We can't just throw them away." Walsh's response chilled everyone within earshot. "People who can't maintain appropriate living arrangements shouldn't work here. It reflects poorly on the company's image." He turned to Sarah with a cold smile. "In fact, your continued advocacy for these individuals raises questions about your judgment as a supervisor." The threat was clear: fall in line or join the unemployed. Marcus watched Sarah's face crumple before she steeled herself, standing straighter. "Then consider this my resignation," she declared, removing her supervisor's badge. Her action sparked something in the warehouse, a moment of clarity about what really mattered. Workers began removing their badges too, placing them on Walsh's desk one by one. Not everyone. Some couldn't afford such a gesture, but enough to send a message. The warehouse's carefully maintained efficiency began to break down as more people walked out. Walsh's face turned purple with rage. "Security, escort these individuals from the premises immediately. And document everything. I want their names. Blacklisted from every Swift ship facility." He turned to the remaining workers. "Anyone else want to join them? No?" The story featured interviews with employees from multiple facilities, all sharing similar experiences of being forced to live in their vehicles while working full-time. Housing advocates were calling it a new form of corporate feudalism, workers tied to their employer's property because they couldn't afford to live anywhere else. Lisa appeared at his car window, looking exhausted but determined. "Some of us are going to tell our stories to the media," she announced. "They need to know this isn't just about living in cars. It's about a system that keeps us trapped in poverty while making the company richer." Her words hit Marcus like physical blows, each one highlighting his own role in creating this crisis. He watched as Walsh emerged from the facility, surrounded by corporate lawyers and consultants. They moved through the parking lot, documenting license plates and taking photos of workers' vehicles, building their case for the midnight evictions. The contrast between their pressed suits and the desperate situation around them perfectly illustrated the disconnect between corporate policy and human reality. Opening his notes one more time, Marcus began drafting what would become his action plan. The problems were clear. Wages that hadn't kept pace with living costs, automated systems that pushed human workers beyond their limits, metrics that prioritized efficiency over human dignity, management policies that treated poverty as a personal failure, a corporate culture that had lost sight of its original mission, but understanding the problems wasn't enough. He needed solutions that would fundamentally transform how Swiftship operated. The company had the resources. Its record profits proved that. What it lacked was the will to prioritize human dignity over shareholder returns. Jasmine organized one final gathering of workers near the warehouse entrance. Despite everything, they stood together, supporting each other in small ways, sharing food, offering temporary places to stay, pooling money for those in the most desperate situations. Their solidarity in crisis showed Marcus what his company could have been if it had maintained its original values. His phone buzzed again, this time with news that would force his hand. The board had scheduled an emergency press conference for the next morning to address leadership concerns. They planned to announce a temporary management committee to run the company in his absence. Time was running out. Marcus looked around the parking lot one last time, taking in the scene that would forever change how he viewed his life's work. The workers who had kept his company running, who had sacrificed their health and dignity for its success, were being discarded like obsolete machinery. The system he'd built had become a monster, optimizing human suffering in the name of efficiency. Tomorrow, he would reveal himself and face the consequences of his investigation. But tonight, he needed to complete his understanding of exactly what his company had become. Only then could he hope to transform it into what it should have been. All along, a force for genuine progress that lifted people up rather than grinding them down. Dawn broke over the Oakland facility as Marcus prepared for the most important day of his career. He'd spent the night organizing his evidence and preparing his strategy, knowing that the next few hours would determine not just his future, but the futures of thousands of workers across the country. The board's emergency press conference was scheduled for 9 a.m. They planned to announce new leadership and a series of policy changes that would likely make things even worse for the workers. In his car, Marcus changed into the suit he'd kept hidden throughout his investigation. The transformation felt symbolic, removing the worn clothes of Mark Chang and resuming his identity as Marcus Chen, CEO of SwiftShip. But he was no longer the same person who had started this journey. The past 2 weeks had stripped away his corporate detachment, replacing it with a profound understanding of the human cost of his company's success. He drove to a nearby gym to shower and prepare himself properly. Looking in the mirror, he barely recognized himself. The exhaustion of warehouse work and car living had left its mark. His face was leaner, his eyes harder, his understanding of his company forever changed. He'd experienced firsthand what his workers endured daily, and that knowledge would guide everything that followed. Before heading to corporate headquarters, Marcus made one final stop at the warehouse. The parking lot was nearly empty now. Walsh's midnight deadline had forced most car-dwelling workers to flee. A few remained, either unable or unwilling to leave, watching nervously as security guards circled their vehicles. The scene strengthened his resolve. Sarah Chen was there, helping a young worker pack her car. She looked up as Marcus approached, not yet recognizing him in his business attire. "If you're from corporate, you're too late," she said wearily. "Most people already left. You've successfully cleaned up your PR problem." "Actually," Marcus replied, watching recognition slowly dawn on her face, "I'm here to fix it." He held out his hand. "I'm Marcus Chen, CEO of SwiftShip, and I need your help to make this right." The shock on Sarah's face quickly turned to anger, then confusion, and finally a cautious hope as Marcus explained his undercover investigation. More workers gathered around as he spoke, including Ray and Lisa, their expressions moving through similar emotions as they realized their co-worker Mark was actually the CEO. "I've seen everything," Marcus told them. "The impossible quotas, the housing crisis, the dehumanizing policies. I've lived it with you, and in about 2 hours, I'm going to face the board and demand fundamental changes. But first, I need something from you." He laid out his plan. The board and press would be gathering at headquarters, expecting a simple leadership transition. Instead, they would face the full reality of what SwiftShip had become. But he needed the workers' help to make it undeniable. Jasmine, ever the organizer, immediately began coordinating. Workers who had lost their jobs would carpool to headquarters. Those still employed would document everything during their shifts. Sarah and other supervisors would compile their records of policy abuses. The underground support network that had helped workers survive would now help expose the truth. Marcus shared his private number with key workers, ensuring he could coordinate with them during the confrontation to come. "The board needs to understand that this isn't just about public relations," he explained. "It's about basic human dignity and the future of our company." Ray pulled him aside as preparations continued. "You lived like us, worked like us," the older man said quietly. "But can you really change things? The system's bigger than one person, even the CEO." Marcus showed Ray the detailed plans he'd developed during his investigation. Proposals for worker housing programs, revised wage structures, reformed management policies, and fundamental changes to how success was measured. "The system is bigger than one person," he agreed. "But change has to start somewhere, and it starts today." Before leaving, Marcus gathered everyone present. "What you've built here, the way you support each other, help each other survive, that's what SwiftShip should have been all along. A company that lifts people up instead of grinding them down. I can't undo what's been done, but I can promise you this. By the end of today, everything changes." He headed to his car, now followed by a convoy of workers' vehicles. The media, crews still outside the warehouse, picked up on the activity, their cameras following the procession. Marcus smiled grimly. Let them come. The more witnesses to what was about to happen, the better. His phone buzzed with messages from board members and executives demanding his presence at the emergency meeting. They had no idea he was already on his way, bringing with him everything needed to expose the truth about their efficiency improvements and optimization initiatives. As he drove toward headquarters, Marcus reflected on his journey from corporate detachment to human understanding. He'd started this investigation thinking he was examining a housing crisis. Instead, he discovered a crisis of values, his own and his company's. Now came the hard part, forcing real change in a system designed to resist it. The gleaming corporate tower came into view, its glass surfaces reflecting the morning sun. Somewhere in there, the board was preparing to remove him and continue business as usual. They had no idea that their CEO had spent 2 weeks living in his car, working in their warehouses, experiencing firsthand the human cost of their policies. By the end of the day, they would understand exactly what their pursuit of profit had created and why it had to change. The SwiftShip corporate headquarters buzzed with tension as board members, executives, and press gathered in the main conference room. The glass-walled space on the 42nd floor offered sweeping views of the city, a stark contrast to the warehouse parking lots where workers made their homes. Television cameras were set up, ready to broadcast the announcement of emergency. Leadership changes. Board Chairman Richard Maxwell stood at the podium, reviewing his prepared statement about maintaining stability and addressing recent challenges. Behind him, a PowerPoint presentation displayed carefully crafted graphs, showing SwiftShip's growth and efficiency metrics, the same metrics that had pushed workers to the breaking point. The elevator dinged, and Marcus stepped out, followed by Sarah, Ray, Lisa, and a group of warehouse workers. Their worn clothes and exhausted faces seemed out of place among the pressed suits and polished appearances of corporate leadership. Security moved to intercept them, but Marcus held up his ID badge. "They're with me," he said firmly. The room fell silent as Marcus walked to the podium. Maxwell's face reddened with anger. "Marcus, where have you been? We were about to replace me?" Marcus interrupted, his voice carrying across the stunned room. "About to continue pretending that everything's fine while our workers sleep in their cars. Not today." He turned to address the assembled press directly. "My name is Marcus Chen, CEO of SwiftShip. For the past 2 weeks, I've been working undercover in our warehouses, living exactly as our workers live, experiencing firsthand what our pursuit of profit has created." The room erupted in chaos. Board members jumped to their feet. Reporters shouted questions. Cameras flashed. Maxwell tried to regain control, but Marcus continued, his voice rising above the din. 2 weeks ago, I saw comments about workers sleeping in their cars. Instead of accepting the PR team's assurances that everything was fine, I decided to see for myself. I became Mark Chang, a new hire at our Oakland facility. I worked 12-hour shifts, lived in my car, and experienced exactly what thousands of our workers endure every day. He gestured to the workers behind him. These aren't just employees. They're the people who kept this company running while we celebrated record profits. Sarah Chen, a supervisor who resigned rather than enforce inhumane policies. Ray Martinez, a veteran worker who lives in his car while training new hires. Lisa Thompson, who collapsed on the warehouse floor but couldn't afford to miss a shift. The corporate team tried to interrupt, but Marcus held up his hand. "You've all seen the viral videos, read the news stories, but I've lived it. I've felt the exhaustion of working impossible quotas. I've experienced the humiliation of changing clothes in public restrooms. I've seen managers like Gregory Walsh threaten and intimidate workers who dare to speak up." He pulled out his phone, connecting it to the presentation screen. The carefully prepared PowerPoint disappeared, replaced by photos and videos from his investigation. Workers sleeping in their cars, struggling to meet automated quotas, supporting each other in small acts of human dignity. "This isn't just a PR crisis," Marcus declared. It's a moral crisis. Every efficiency metric we celebrated, every productivity gain we applauded, they all came at a human cost. We built a system that treats people as disposable parts in a profit-making machine. The board members shifted uncomfortably as Marcus displayed their internal documents alongside his findings. The contrast between corporate projections and ground-level reality was stark and damning. "Mr. Chen," Maxwell attempted to interject, "this is highly irregular. We should discuss this in private." "No more private discussions," Marcus cut him off. "No more hiding the truth. Our workers live their reality in public, sleep in public, struggle in public. It's time for us to face our failures in public too." He turned to the workers behind him. "Sarah, would you like to tell them about Walsh's retaliation against car-dwelling workers? Ray, how about explaining the impossible choice between paying rent and buying food? Lisa, would you share what it's like to work while sick because you can't afford to miss a shift?" One by one, the workers stepped forward to tell their stories. Their voices, usually silenced by corporate hierarchy, filled the room with raw truth. Reporters scribbled frantically, cameras rolled, and the board members watched in growing dismay as their carefully constructed narrative crumbled. "This stops today," Marcus announced, pulling out a thick folder of documents. "I have here a comprehensive plan for immediate changes, living wages based on local housing costs, corporate-sponsored affordable housing near our facilities, reform management policies that prioritize human dignity over abstract metrics, and immediate dismissal of managers who enabled or enforced abusive practices." Maxwell stood up, his face purple with rage. "You can't unilaterally make these decisions. The board has two choices," Marcus interrupted. "Either approve these changes, or I release every detail of my investigation to the media. Every metric that pushed workers beyond human limits, every policy that forced them into poverty, every executive who knew and did nothing, everything." The room fell silent as the magnitude of the moment sank in. Marcus Chen, the CEO who had helped build SwiftShip into a logistics giant, had just publicly exposed his own company's darkest secrets, and he'd done it in a way that made it impossible to dismiss or ignore. "The choice is yours," Marcus concluded, looking each board member in the eye. "But understand this, I've lived the reality our workers face. I've experienced what our policies have created, and I will not stop until we make this right." The aftermath of Marcus's revelation was immediate and fierce. Board member Trevor Richardson, head of the Finance Committee, was the first to mount organized resistance. "This is corporate suicide," he declared, standing up to address the room. "These proposed changes would cut our profit margins by 30%. Our shareholders will revolt." Other executives quickly joined the opposition. Janet Morris, VP of Operations, pulled up financial projections on her tablet. "Our entire competitive advantage is built on operational efficiency," she argued. "These changes would make us vulnerable to every startup with a fleet of delivery vans." The corporate machine was fighting back, doing what it did best, reducing human lives to numbers on spreadsheets. Marcus had anticipated this response, but the cold calculation still stunned him. Even faced with undeniable evidence of human suffering, they spoke only of profit margins and market share. "Let's talk about real numbers," Marcus countered, pulling up his own data. "Average rent within 20 miles of our Oakland facility, $2,800 per month. Average worker salary after taxes, $2,600 per month. Basic utilities and food costs, $800 minimum. The math doesn't work, and you all know it." Walsh, who had been summoned to the meeting, tried to defend his management style. "We maintain industry-standard practices," he insisted. "If workers Can't afford housing. That's a personal financial problem, not a corporate responsibility. The words ignited something in Sarah Chen. Personal financial problem? She stepped forward, her voice shaking with controlled anger. I had a worker choose between buying insulin and paying rent. Another who missed his child's birth because he couldn't risk losing his shift. A single mother who hasn't seen her kids awake in weeks because she works doubles to afford a studio apartment. These aren't personal financial problems. They're human rights issues. Maxwell attempted to steer the conversation back to traditional corporate territory. Perhaps we could form a committee to study the housing situation, he suggested smoothly. Create a task force to explore potential solutions. Over the next quarter, no more committees, Marcus cut him off. No more studies. No more delays. He turned to the assembled press. Would you like to see the data on how many committees we've formed over the years? How many studies we've buried? How many task forces have produced reports that never led to action? The two opposition shifted tactics. Linda Hayes, head of legal, raised concerns about liability. These workers chose to live in their vehicles, she argued. If we acknowledge responsibility now, we expose ourselves to massive legal risk. Marcus had expected this too. He nodded to Ray, who stepped forward to share his story. The veteran worker described how the company's scheduling algorithm had systematically eliminated full-time positions, forcing workers into variable shifts that made traditional housing impossible. The legal argument about choice crumbled in the face of his calm, detailed explanation of systematic exploitation. Some board members tried to paint Marcus's investigation as a publicity stunt. 2 weeks of playing poverty tourist doesn't qualify you to remake corporate policy, one sneered. The workers behind Marcus bristled at the dismissal of their daily reality. Lisa, still pale from her recent collapse but standing firm, addressed this criticism directly. He lived exactly as we live, she testified. Worked the same shifts, faced the same challenges. He experienced what we experience every day, not as a tourist, but as one of us. The resistance grew more desperate. Executives warned about automation companies eager to replace human workers entirely. Others suggested that helping workers would only encourage dependency. Some even tried to paint car dwelling as a lifestyle choice, a form of voluntary simplicity that the company shouldn't discourage. Marcus met each argument with evidence from his investigation. When they talked about worker productivity, he showed them the human cost of their metrics. When they discussed market competition, he revealed how their efficiency gains were built on exploited labor. When they worried about shareholder value, he demonstrated how sustainable worker support would drive long-term growth. You're not just risking your position, Maxwell warned him quietly during a brief break. The board can remove you. Your entire legacy at Swiftship could be erased. Marcus smiled grimly. My legacy? Look around this room. These workers are my legacy. Every person sleeping in their car, every family separated by impossible schedules, every human being ground down by our pursuit of profit. That's the legacy I need to change. The opposition's final strategy was to propose half measures, minimal wage increases, voluntary housing assistance programs, slightly relaxed productivity quotas. But Marcus stood firm, supported by the workers whose reality he'd shared. We're not negotiating band-aids for a systemic wound, he declared. Every compromise you suggest is built on the same broken foundation. The idea that worker dignity is secondary to corporate profit. That ends today. As the resistance continued, Marcus noticed something powerful happening. Other executives, particularly younger ones who worked more closely with warehouse operations, began speaking up in support of comprehensive change. They shared their own observations of the growing crisis, their discomfort with current policies, their desire to build something better. The opposition wasn't backing down, but neither was Marcus. He had lived the reality of his workers' lives, and he wouldn't let corporate inertia maintain a system that traded human dignity for profit margins. The real fight was just beginning, and he was prepared for a long battle to transform Swiftship into what it should have been all along, a company that valued people over packages. Marcus stood at the podium, no longer interested in debating with those who refused to see the humanity in their workers. The time for discussion was over. Action needed to be taken immediately, and as CEO, he still held the power to make executive decisions. "Effective immediately," he announced, his voice cutting through the chaos in the boardroom. "I am implementing the following changes across all Swiftship facilities." He began reading from a document he'd prepared during his investigation, each point landing like a thunderbolt in the stunned room. First, all workers will receive an immediate 40% wage increase, with additional housing allowances based on local cost of living. This is non-negotiable and will be implemented within 48 hours. He paused as gasps and protests erupted from the financial team, but continued undeterred. Second, we are converting our land holdings near each facility into affordable housing. Developments for our workers. The empty lots we've been holding for future expansion will better serve our company by housing the people who keep it running. He nodded to Bianca, who began distributing detailed plans for the housing developments. Third, every manager at every facility will be evaluated based on new metrics that prioritize worker welfare alongside operational efficiency. Those who cannot or will not adapt to this new approach will be removed from their positions. His eyes found Walsh in the crowd, the message clear. Fourth, we are establishing an emergency fund of $500 million effective today to provide immediate housing assistance to workers currently living in their vehicles. This includes rent subsidies, down payment assistance, and temporary housing support. The financial officers began frantically calculating on their tablets, but Marcus pressed on. Fifth, all productivity quotas are being immediately revised to account for human limitations. The algorithm will serve the workers, not the other way around. He gestured to the technology team. I want these changes implemented across all systems by end of day. Sarah Chen stepped forward with additional documentation, detailed plans she and Marcus had developed during brief meetings between warehouse shifts. We've already identified suitable properties for immediate housing development, she explained, displaying maps on the screen. These could be ready for occupancy within 3 months. The board erupted in protests, but Marcus held up his hand. I'm not finished. Every worker who was terminated or forced to resign due to housing issues will be offered immediate reinstatement with back pay. This includes everyone affected by Walsh's recent actions at the Oakland facility. He turned to the legal team, who were already preparing objections. And before you argue about procedure, I've had outside counsel review everything. As CEO, I have full authority to implement emergency measures to address a crisis that threatens our company's survival. This qualifies. The practical details of implementation began flowing. Marcus called in the HR team, ordering immediate processing of wage adjustments. The IT department was instructed to begin recoding the productivity algorithms. Facilities. Managers were directed to start converting warehouse break rooms into proper rest areas. For those concerned about costs, Marcus addressed the financial officers directly, we'll offset these expenses by reducing executive bonuses and eliminating wasteful corporate perks. No more private jets, no more luxury retreats, no more million-dollar consulting contracts that produce nothing but PowerPoint presentations. Ray and Lisa began working with HR to create a new employee support system, one that would be run by workers who understood the challenges firsthand. Jasmine coordinated with the legal team to ensure worker protections were properly documented and enforced. Additionally, Marcus continued, we're establishing a worker council with real power. They'll have direct input into policy decisions and a seat on the board. No more decisions about worker welfare without worker participation. This announcement sent another shockwave through the corporate leadership. The press recorded everything, their cameras capturing the historic moment when one of the world's largest logistics companies fundamentally transformed its relationship with its workers. Marcus knew the footage would inspire others, perhaps even force change across the industry. He turned to the workers who had supported his investigation. I need your help to implement these changes. You understand the real challenges better than any consultant or efficiency expert. Will you work with us to build something better? The response was immediate and enthusiastic. Workers who had lived the problems were eager to be part of the solution. They broke into teams, each focusing on different aspects of the transformation: housing, scheduling, training, support services. For those executives who cannot support these changes, Marcus addressed the opposition directly. Your resignations will be accepted without prejudice. But understand this, SwiftShip is transforming with or without you. The actual work of implementation began immediately. Meeting rooms were converted into action centers, with workers and corporate staff working side by side to make the changes real. The hierarchy that had separated warehouse floor from executive suite began to dissolve as people focused on solving real problems together. Marcus moved through the groups, ensuring every detail was addressed. Emergency housing, arrangements for those most in need, immediate relief for workers facing financial crises, new training programs for managers learning to prioritize human welfare alongside efficiency. We're not just changing policies, he announced as the day's work continued. We're changing our fundamental understanding of what a successful company looks like. Efficiency without humanity is failure. Profit without dignity is loss. We're going to prove that taking care of our people is the best business decision we can make. 3 months after Marcus's revelation and the implementation of sweeping changes, the Oakland facility had become a model for corporate transformation. The parking lot, once filled with workers living in their vehicles, now stood half empty as employees moved into the newly completed first phase of worker housing, modern apartments built on what had been vacant SwiftShip land. Sarah Chen, reinstated with a promotion to Regional Director of Worker Relations, led a tour of the changes for industry observers and media. The warehouse floor had been redesigned with worker input, featuring adjustable workstations, adequate break areas, and reasonable quotas that respected human limitations. "Watch this," she said, pointing to a worker who had just completed his quota for the hour. Instead of pushing for more productivity, the system automatically suggested a short break. We now optimize for sustainable performance, not maximum extraction. Our overall efficiency is actually up, even with lower individual quotas, because people aren't burning out. The transformation wasn't just physical. Walsh and managers like him had been replaced by leaders who understood the connection between worker welfare and company success. Ray had been promoted to lead worker training, bringing his years of experience to help new hires learn not just procedures, but how to sustain themselves in the long term. Lisa, fully recovered and now heading the worker wellness program, showed visitors the new medical station. "We don't just treat injuries anymore," she explained. "We prevent them. Regular health checks, stress monitoring, actual breaks when people need them. The algorithm now protects workers instead of pushing them past their limits." The changes had ripple effects throughout the company. Teams of workers and executives traveled to other facilities, implementing similar transformations across the SwiftShip network. The South Bay facility's oppressive automation had been reprogrammed to support human workers rather than replace them. North Valley's rigid efficiency metrics had been rebuilt around sustainable human performance. Jasmine, now serving on the newly established Worker Council, presented data showing the impact of the changes. "Turnover is down 80%, she reported during a company-wide meeting. "Productivity is up 25% when measured across full shifts. Injury rates have plummeted. It turns out treating people like humans actually improves performance." The Emergency Housing Fund had already helped hundreds of workers transition from their cars to proper homes. But more importantly, the increased wages and housing allowances meant new hires wouldn't face the same crisis. The company had broken the cycle of working poverty it had helped create. Marcus wandered through the facility, now barely recognizable from his days as Mark Chang. Workers moved with purpose, but without fear, coordinating with automated systems that complemented their work instead of controlling it. The haunted looks and desperate exhaustion had been replaced by focused engagement. "Remember this spot?" Ray asked, stopping by the station where Lisa had collapsed months ago. Now, it featured a new break area and hydration station. Hard to believe how different things were just a few months back. The veteran worker had become a symbol of the old guard helping to build something better. The transformation hadn't been without challenges. Some executives had resigned rather than adapt to the new approach. Shareholders had initially panicked, driving the stock price down. But as the positive changes showed measurable results, lower turnover, higher productivity, better quality control, the market had responded. SwiftShip's stock was now reaching new highs, proving that ethical treatment of workers could coexist with business success. The worker housing development had become a community hub. Beyond just providing affordable homes, it included childcare, facilities, health services, and common areas that encouraged social connection. Workers who had once lived isolated in their cars now gathered for community meals and events. The automated systems that had once pushed workers to exhaustion had been reprogrammed with worker input. The new algorithms included human factors, like fatigue, stress levels, and personal circumstances. Productivity was still tracked, but as part of a holistic approach to sustainable performance rather than a punitive metric. In the facility's new training center, experienced workers like Ray shared their knowledge with new hires. But instead of just teaching efficiency, they taught sustainability, how to maintain health, how to balance work demands, how to build a career rather than just survive a job. The transformation had attracted attention across the industry. Other companies sent observers, some skeptical but all curious about how SwiftShip had turned a crisis into an opportunity for revolutionary change. Marcus made sure they saw everything, the good and the bad, the successes and the ongoing challenges. The key was giving workers real power, he explained to a group of industry leaders. Not just token representation, but actual authority to shape how the company operates. They knew what needed to change because they lived with the consequences of our old system. The Worker Council had become a powerful force for continuous improvement. Regular meetings between workers and management ensured that new policies actually served those they were meant to help. The hierarchy that had once separated warehouse floor from corporate offices had been replaced by genuine collaboration. Even the most skeptical observers couldn't deny the results. SwiftShip's transformation had created a new model for corporate success, one that proved treating workers with dignity wasn't just morally right, but financially smart. The company had emerged stronger, more efficient and more profitable by putting people first. 6 months after his undercover journey began, Marcus Chen stood in the Oakland facility's new community center, surrounded by workers and their families, celebrating the complete implementation of SwiftShip's transformation. The room buzzed with energy as people shared stories of their journeys, from crisis to stability, from survival to growth. "I remember the night this all started," Marcus began his address to the gathered crowd. "I was sitting in my office, reading about workers sleeping in their cars, and I thought I understood the problem. I was wrong. I didn't understand anything until I lived it myself." He looked around the room, meeting the eyes of those who had shared his journey. Ray, now running worker development programs across multiple facilities. Lisa, whose health crisis had become a catalyst for change in worker welfare policies. Sarah. Chen, whose moral stand against Walsh had inspired a new approach to management. "The real transformation wasn't in our policies or our procedures," Marcus continued. "It was in our understanding of what a company can be. We thought efficiency meant pushing people to their limits. We thought productivity meant sacrificing humanity. We thought success meant maximizing profit at any cost. We were wrong about all of it." The evidence of change surrounded them. Through the windows, they could see the new worker housing complex, its lights warm and welcoming in the evening sky. The warehouse floor beyond had been transformed into a space that respected human dignity while maintaining operational excellence. But the most significant changes were in the faces of the workers themselves, no longer haunted by exhaustion and fear, but bright with purpose and possibility. "Some people called our transformation radical," Marcus acknowledged. "They said it was too expensive, too disruptive, too idealistic. But look at the results. Our turnover rate is the lowest in the industry. Our productivity is higher than ever. Our workers aren't just surviving, they're thriving. And yes, our profits are strong, not despite treating people well, but because of it." He gestured to Jasmine, who had become a powerful voice on the Worker Council. "The real innovation wasn't in our technology or our logistics. It was in remembering that every algorithm, every efficiency metric, every productivity goal ultimately depends on human beings. And human beings need more than just a paycheck. They need dignity, community, and hope." The transformation had rippled beyond Swiftship. Other companies, faced with similar crises, had begun implementing their own reforms. The industry was slowly recognizing that the race to the bottom in worker treatment was ultimately self-defeating. Swiftship's success had proven there was another way. "But we're not finished," Marcus declared. "This is just the beginning. Every day we learn something new about how to build a better workplace, how to support our people, how to grow sustainably, and we learn it by listening to the people who know best, our workers themselves." He walked through the crowd, stopping to talk with families who had moved from cars to homes, workers who had advanced into leadership roles, new hires who would never know the desperation of the old system. Each story reinforced the fundamental truth he had discovered during his undercover journey, that corporate success and human dignity were not opposing forces, but essential partners. "The lesson I learned sleeping in my car, working alongside you, experiencing the reality of our old system, wasn't just about housing or wages," Marcus reflected. "It was about what we owe each other as human beings, about the responsibility that comes with power, about the difference between building a profitable company and building a worthy one." The celebration continued into the evening, but it wasn't just a party. It was a testament to resilience, to the power of collective action, to the possibility of genuine change. Workers who had once hidden their struggles now shared their stories openly, helping others understand the importance of maintaining the new culture they had built together. As the event wound down, Marcus found himself back in the parking lot where his journey had begun. The space that had once been filled with workers living in their vehicles was now just a parking lot again, serving its intended purpose rather than as a symptom of systemic failure. "We did it," Ray said, joining him in the cool evening air. "We actually did it. Marcus shook his head. No, you did it, all of you. I just finally got out of the way and let the real experts, the workers themselves, show us how to build something better. Looking at the transformed facility, the new housing complex, and most importantly, the transformed lives of his workers, Marcus understood that his undercover journey had revealed something profound, that the greatest efficiency, the highest productivity, and the strongest profits come not from treating people as resources to be optimized, but as human beings to be supported and empowered. The story of SwiftShip's transformation would be studied in business schools, analyzed by economists, and debated by industry leaders. But its true impact could be seen in the simple fact that no worker would ever again have to choose between a job and a home, between productivity and dignity, between survival and humanity. The real bottom line, Marcus concluded in his final remarks of the evening, isn't measured in dollars or deliveries. It's measured in lives transformed, in communities built, in dignity restored. That's the true profit of doing business the right way.